there was an investigation that was published in the CapTimes reporting a review of public records that revealed the state of Wisconsin has investigated around 200 educators over the last 5 years for allegations of grooming and sexual misconduct. And it has opened up a much larger conversation as far as how these investigations are handled, the resources needed to handle them at the state level versus getting law enforcement involved. And the reporter who's been uncovering all of this is Danielle DuClos from the CapTimes. She joins us now to talk a little bit more about how this story started and also where it potentially is going to go from here. So welcome to the show, Danielle.
Thank you for having me.
So I guess what was the original thread for this story that you started pulling on? Because it was a year investigation, right?
Yeah, so this reporting journey actually started a few years ago for me when I was a reporter in Green Bay and I had covered just one case in one school district. And as I was doing that reporting, I realized that this story was a lot larger than just one case. And I wanted to answer the question, how often is educator sexual misconduct and grooming being investigated? How often are these complaints being made throughout the state of Wisconsin? And so that's how this reporting started. We set out to answer that question and started with the investigations at the Department of Public Instruction.
Daniel, in your reporting, a big piece of this is access to the records. And I know that from DPI, they trickle out. But the school districts, that seems to be the stumbling block here because as I was reading in your reporting, massive amounts of money asked for in exchange, here's the records. That seems like sort of a blockade to getting the information that you need to actually report on what's going on.
Yes. So the second part of the reporting came out this morning, and that really focused on the amount of money that school districts wanted to charge for access to these records. So we asked the 20 largest school districts by enrollment in the state of Wisconsin. We sent them all the same exact records request, asking for investigation records, resignation agreements, complaints reports of investigations they had conducted into their own employees going back to 2017. And some of the prices they wanted to charge were quite large. The Janesville School District wanted more than $245,000 to provide these records. Middleton wanted $40,000. Sheboygan wanted $17,000. The Madison Metropolitan School District was looking for more than $4,000. And frankly, that's just not money that we can afford to pay to get those records.
So how did you eventually get them? Because you obviously, no offense, but I'm sure the CapTimes doesn't have that kind of money. You just throw out.
Right. And so we ended up having to significantly narrow the scope of our requests in a lot of instances. But for the Janesville School District, I hopped on the phone with one of their administrators and really talked to them. This is what we're looking for. And the costs pretty much disappeared. We said, we want the investigation records and we want, anyone who's resigned and that you've had to refer to the Department of Public Instruction. We want records into those cases. And so we did eventually get records from them, but some of the records were missing too. So we had to follow back up and say, hey, where are the records for X, Y, and Z? And finally, those were provided, but it definitely was a long journey.
So that's the record side of this, sort of the investigatory piece that, great journalists like yourself actually have to write the stories. But then there's the conduct piece of this. And as we read your stories and we hear about this from the context of how teachers are acting with students in an educational environment, do we know how serious this is given what the DPI has released or what they've told us? Because a lot of this is protected. Obviously, allegations are not charges, and we have to always, assume that someone's innocent until proven guilty. How much do we actually know about what's going on? What is the most significant piece of this that we don't know yet when it comes to sexual abuse or mistreatment of children in schools?
That's a great question. And there's still a lot that isn't known because there isn't great tracking of data on this, right? Even nationwide, there isn't great data. And so the CapTimes, reviewed a bunch of records trying to get good data. And we reviewed more than 450 of the Department of Public Instruction's licensed misconduct investigations. And still for about a fifth of those, we were unable to categorize the conduct that was under investigation. So there's still some unknown there. And that's why in our reporting, we said at least 44% of those cases had to do with allegations of sexual misconduct or grooming, because it's likely an undercount since there is that gap in the cases we were able to categorize.
So in your reporting for this, have you looked at other states and is there a model of a state that is doing this well? Because this seems like a very convoluted situation as far as there is districts, there is DPI, there is a state statute, there is when do you get law enforcement, and then there's also what software exists to track all of this? And then also, where do you even go to start to try to get access if you are the public? And so is there any state that has kind of figured this out?
Yeah, so there are a bunch of different states that do this differently. The CapTimes will be putting out reporting looking at what Wisconsin is doing and what other states are doing. And so that's to come.
Okay.
But other states like Florida, you can look up, you can search an educator's name and get like any disciplinary action against them and look up the reasons why they were disciplined or lost their license. And there are other states like Arizona, Idaho, and Pennsylvania that put out annual reports and statistics on the investigations that their state education departments are conducting, with things like how many investigations were conducted, what types of things were they investigating. Arizona even looks at like the different types of licenses that they were investigating, since it's not just teachers, right? Looking at, principals and things like that. And so those are some other states that do have like reports where they put out and track this data and make that publicly available.
Go ahead.
Well, is that why? Because in the framing of your investigation, and I know that was part of what DPI's reaction was, is the framing of this was information that was not available to the public. Now, it was available if you requested a public record. So are you saying in comparison to other states that publish this for easy access, that's what the comparison was as far as why you said it wasn't available to the public?
Yes. So in terms of getting these numbers, right, the CapTimes spent a year analyzing these records. We put in for a public records request to get the Department of Public Instruction's internal like tracking document for how they track these investigations, which is a spreadsheet. And so they sent that to us along with a document of just case note summaries, so kind of summaries of the investigations from about 2019 through part of 2022. And so we use that to really go through each case and to figure out and categorize the conduct. In order to like get all of the details, you'd have to hand request through the open records law each educator's file. And so for those about 100 cases, the fifth of the cases that we reviewed that I mentioned we weren't able to code the conduct, in July, we put in a records request for about 100 educator case files, and we have not received records back from that yet.
How would you characterize the response from the Department of Public Instruction, Superintendent of Public Instruction, Jill Underly, and their demand, apparently, for a retraction of a word that you used in one of your stories?
So the CapTimes stands by its reporting. We spent a year investigating this. We asked Dr. Underly for an interview prior to publication, and she declined. And since she released her statement, we extended another invitation for an interview with us, and so she could share her perspectives, and she also declined that interview request. So we stand by our reporting.
And so, Danielle, obviously, I would say this reporting does what I think most investigative reporters hopes, that it starts a conversation, sheds light on something that needs to be fixed at the legislature or some level as far as the outside stakeholders taking action. And luckily, that is exactly what happened, right? We're having a hearing tomorrow in the Assembly talking about what changes need to be made through lawmakers to impact the current situation of how many people are affected by the current system. And so I know you're a reporter and not an analyst, but in looking through all of this, what are some of the number one things that could be done to improve the process from where it is today?
Yeah, so we will have more reporting out on this. So don't want to put, the cart before the horse, but some of the things that the advocates, the prevention advocates and the researchers I spoke with for this story said is really the data tracking is a big part of it. And the reason for that, as a misconduct prevention trainer and researcher, Billy Joe Grant said, is that if you don't understand the scope of a problem, it's really hard to allocate resources to address it and to know what's needed to address that. And, the Department of Public Instruction has said that they lack enough staffing and funding for this. And so having tracking and understanding that would help allocate resources, and as well as access to this information was a big thing. And particularly if someone loses their license, whether they voluntarily surrender it or it's revoked by the state, having that information about why they lost their license as easily accessible as the fact that they lost their license would be key in prevention as well.
You can answer this one or not answer it. I'm just curious. In any other agencies in the state of Wisconsin, have we seen a case where a leader of that department, that agency, has essentially refused to do any public-facing events or interacting with the individuals that those departments or agencies impact, in this case, parents, families, school districts? Have you seen anything like that?
Honestly, I can't speak to that because I've been so focused and ingrained right on this investigation for the last year. So I wouldn't be able to speak to what other agencies have been doing or agency heads in terms of, public conversations about what their agency operations are.
I'll speak to it because most agency leaders are always encouraged to go out and speak to the public, and I'm not seeing that. But as we've said over and over again on this show, the Superintendent of Public Instruction, Jill Underly, is welcome to come on. We'll give her a whole hour on the show. She can address this or any of the issues.
And so additionally, there's the tracking issue and the investment and resources needed to do the tracking. How much of a difference would it make? Because right now there is no state law against or like even defining what grooming is, right? And that's part of what the new legislation could be. Is how much of that would make a difference as far as the limitations of DPI when it comes to being able to subpoena people or being able to, like, where's the line between law enforcement versus DPI and what they can do based on what the state statute says?
Yeah, so I know there's been talk among lawmakers about drafting legislation. So without seeing like what the final text of that is, it's hard to say what the actual practical implications would be. But yeah, these are different than law enforcement investigations. So I want to be really clear about that. We were specifically looking at licensure investigations by the Department of Public Instruction, which serve a different purpose than a law enforcement investigation. And so those investigations by DPI are looking at whether someone should keep their teaching license. And then, of course, a law enforcement investigation is looking at whether a crime occurred. But currently, the state statute that DPI uses, the standard to look at licenses, refers to, quote, immoral conduct, and that's defined as conduct or behavior that is contrary to commonly accepted moral or ethical standards and that endangers the health, safety, welfare, or education of any student. So it's a vague and a broad definition, but DPI seems to think that, and they've said that adding explicit would be helpful for them. So interested to see where the discussion goes with lawmakers and what comes next.
I think every parent, including myself, is very interested in where this story goes. So thank you for your reporting on this. I'm excited to see the additional additions you have getting published in the next couple of weeks. Danielle DuClos, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me.